Today I'm going to show you how to make an easy improv block from your fabric strips. Hi, I'm Kim Jamieson-Hirst of Chatterbox Quilts, and today I want to show you how to take a piece of solid fabric, or solidish fabric, and add strips around it from your scrap fabrics to make a really cool improv block. So the one you see in front of me here started off with a 5.5-inch block in the center, and that's kind of what's going to start deciding the size of your block. It's not going to be what the block finishes on, obviously, but if you start with a 5.5-inch square, you know that it's going to be much bigger than that by the time you're done. It also depends on the number of rounds that you're going to put around that center square. So for this demonstration, I'm going to start with a 4.5-inch square, so I shall hopefully have a block that is a little bit smaller than this one when I finish. So next thing to do, after you've got your center block cut out, is to get some fabric strips. Okay, so leftover strips from projects. And you need to make sure that they're going to be long enough to go around this block that you've chosen to be your center. So, for example, if I go to put this on, I know that I'm going to be covering the whole width of that block in the first round. But then when I cut it off, the block is then going to be that much higher. So the next strip I need to put on, let's just say I want to put this orange one on, has to be able to cover from there to the bottom of the block. So you see, every time you add a strip, it needs to be just a little bit longer. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. What happens if you don't have a long enough strip though? Well, you can always piece strips together to get that size that is required. The other thing I wanted to mention to you, and you'll see me do it as I go to sew, is that I don't necessarily have to keep that square, that perfect square, in the center. So I could actually stitch these on an angle. All right, so something like this. And that's going to change the size of that square, and it'll change the size of the block as we add on too. So let's go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how to add these strips on to increase the size of that block. So I'm at the sewing machine, and I've got my block, and I've got my strips, and I've got my glasses, because I always say, if you can't see, you can't sew. So let's start off with one of these strips. So I have a whole bunch of them there. It's easier to pull them first, and then I don't have to go looking through my scraps. So I'm going to start at the top here, and I'm going to add that first strip on. So I put them right sides together and line them up. Now, do I line them up though? How do I line them up? Okay, so do I line them up where I'm going right along that square, or do I want to line it up so, and I'm going to flip it over here so you can see, so it's on a bit of an angle? Well, let's be rebels. Let's do it on a bit of an angle, okay? So if I go to stitch this, I should say, along, I'm going to be stitching following the edge of the orange fabric, not the white, to get that nice angle. So here's what this looks like. All right, so you can see that I've got excess fabric here, which is fine because we're going to trim that off in just a moment. But you can see that now we've got this little angle going, which is pretty interesting, I think. And we're going to kind of continue that as we go along. So I need to trim this excess fabric off. So I've got my Martelli 12 by 12 inch cutting mat here, which works really well. And I'm using one of their rotary cutters and one of their no-slip rulers too. So I'm just going to trim this along the edge of that white square, okay? So we can just keep that for another project. So that's one strip added. So my next strip needs to go in this direction, and I want to make sure it's long enough, so you can see it's definitely long enough. And then I have to decide, do I put it on an angle as well? Well, why not? Okay, so let's see how we can do that. Let's line this up here. I'm going to take this wider strip, and we're going to work with the wider side first. And we're going to put it on an angle like that and stitch it on with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, and I'm pressing these away from the center block. This is typically how I would construct this type of block, and it especially works well in this case where I've got white fabric in the center because I don't want any of this other fabric shadowing through underneath. All right, so we've got that one going, and again, it'll need to be trimmed as well. So let's do that again. So we're lining it up with the top corner of the white square and following it along to get that piece off. Oh, I like the orange and the green. The blue is looking pretty cool. Now we need to go down here. So we need to pick something else that is going to be long enough. Let me think. I'm looking through my strips here. This is where I overthink things. Okay, ooh, we have a really bright green. Is that going to be too bright? I don't know, but that's pretty long. So I might want to save that because I'm going to do more than one round here. I'm going to do a couple of rounds. So let's just pick another one here. How about this orange one? Okay, you can see that's not, that's not going to be working like here, for example. If we wanted to put another strip on and we've already got a piece in the bottom, that would be very dicey as to whether it would fit in that second round of strips. So, but we know it'll work here. And let's move it. I'm going to change the angle a wee bit here and run from the edge of this up here. Okay, so we're going to do that and get that sewn on. Okay, so there we go with that. I'm using this Violet Crafts seam roller, but if you have access to an iron to press this out, that would work just as well, of course, probably even better. Okay, so let's see what's happening with this little center guy. He's kind of changing his angles a bit as we go along, isn't he? Which is the whole point of adding things on that angle, right? So let's follow this along on its angle. We might be cutting a tad off there because these strips don't necessarily have a straight edge when I go to put them on in the first place. But they will after I trim them up. Okay, so we have one more side to add here. I'm going to have some fun and put on some of this Halloween fabric. I know I have a long piece of this. It's pieced together, as you can see here, because I think I used it for a border. And this is the offcut from that. So I am just going to use part of it here. And I think I'm going to keep this fairly square on this side. Okay, it's the only one we haven't changed the angle on. Oop, there goes my mat. I'll have to get that in a second. All right, so I'm just going to follow along here. This one's off a tad, but that's okay. I'm going to go in a bit on it. Okay, improv, you don't have to be too exact, right? And I know that I've got all this extra fabric here, and I know that I have a seam in there, so I wanted to get at that and get it attached before I got to that seam, which I did. So there we go. Such cute fabric. Okay, so let's get that out. And then we need to trim this up, but I need to get my mat first. Excuse me for a sec. Okay, thankfully it didn't go too far. So we need to do a little bit of trimming here. So we're going to trim here. All right, and then we need to trim this side as well. This is kind of wonky going on here, so we need to move up to here, the angle that that's on, and we'll go like that. So we're lining up with that angle at the top green fabric there. All right, so here's our first round. Now, we could stop here if we wanted to, perfectly fine, right? Or we could continue building. So it depends on what size you want your finished block to be. And in this case, I have some pretty wide fabrics here. I could trim this down at this stage even, down a little bit more, all right? So that we can have narrower strips here, and maybe I build out wider ones as we go along. But I believe I'm going to do some trimming here. I'm going to trim these down a little bit, and then I'm going to add another round of fabric, and then I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I've added another round of strips, and so the block is done as far as the sewing part, but I still need to do some trimming on it. So I'll meet you back at the cutting table to show you how to do that. So here's my block, but I need to do some trimming on it, right? Because you've got some excess fabric hanging out in different places and stuff. So the final round is when you actually do some trimming. Now, let me mention a couple things to you. You can see how much fabric I've got here and there, and it gets less as I go around, it seems like. Having more fabric on these outer rounds, having wider fabric is a good idea because it gives you more options when it comes to trimming, okay? So for example, if I wanted to make this into a 7.5 inch square, I can use my Martelli Square Fussy-cut Windows, and this is a 7.5 inch square, and I could do that with it. I could cut it in different ways, but if I wanted to go to an 8.5, I've got probably enough fabric on most of the areas but this one's going to be a little problematic over there, okay? So it just doesn't give you as many options to trim your block down if you've got some narrow strips here. Plus, when you trim it down, if you trim some off here, you may find that it gets very small. So if you're piecing it into a project, you've only got a thin little sliver, and that looks a bit awkward, certainly on the outside. The inside, not quite as bad, but the outer round should be a bit bigger, so keep that in mind. So going back to the trimming though, let's look at my 7.5-inch square. So the fussy cut windows allow me to see what I would have if I trimmed it down to that size, and it also allows me to play a little bit. So I can play and move it around a little bit here, and I'm always being conscious of my seams. So for example, if I decided to trim it like this, for example, you can see that I'm cutting off, you know, I'm right at the seam there, and you're going to be coming in with a 1/4 inch there. I'm going to be cutting this off. You're going to be in there. It doesn't look so good perhaps when you go to piece it. So I'm going to stay, I should say, on the safe side here, pretty much, and I'm going to make sure I've got more than a 1/4 inch away from all the seams here before I trim it. And I think that would work. I can go over a little bit, maybe more there. Okay, let's say that's good. Then I'm going to take my 7.5-inch No-Slip Square template, remove that fussy cut window, because now I know that I'm going to be okay when I trim this up, and then I'm just going to cut it out. And this is going to give me some crumb fabric to play with in another project. All right, and here's the final reveal. So there we go. All right, so you can see, because of those narrower areas I was talking about, how this is going to be completely lost, I would say, there. So I could have trimmed this to a different way maybe, let's say, but I'm just showing you some of the things you need to be concerned about when you're working with these types of fabric scraps, okay? But still, it's a pretty cute little block, and apparently Salem seems to like this one quite a bit. But you've got the two blocks, one that started with a 5.5-inch square in the center, and you can see I've got those wider pieces on the outside. I haven't trimmed this one up yet, and I could just leave it like this if I wanted to. But with the smaller one, you can see how much smaller this is by keeping the center smaller and only putting a couple of rounds on. This one I think has probably 3 rounds on it. So you can make them different sizes, and it all depends on how big you want your block and how many fabric scraps you have that you can use to create that block. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your quilting friends. And remember to subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified the next time I release a new video. And before you go, check out these other videos I've included just for you. For more helpful quilting information, be sure to go to my website at www.chatterboxquilts.com.